I'm curious, what does that onboarding process look like to a provider? How does it change their workflow? And you talked about earlier some of the mistakes that are happening within hospitals is too many transitions and poor communication. Is this something that's changing in new provider, in using your services and solution, and has that improved?
Well, I wouldn't say it's improved or not. It's just different. So when you're onboarding a patient into the model, let's say they show up in the ED, the patient's not used to going home when they need to go to the hospital, and they're not used to their home being called the hospital. So the onboarding and the workflows associated with onboarding the patient and the family is new, and providers get used to that. The second is getting the patient physically into the home and oriented, and then having the initial care call happen while there's somebody physically present. So we always say that we're virtual plus physical care perfectly integrated, not telemedicine. We're both. We use telemedicine, but no different than anybody uses any kind of technology. The real workflow changes are the integration of acute care with post-acute care. We don't believe in post-acute care. Our philosophy is either you're sick or you're not sick. You're not post-hospital sick. You're sick or you're not sick. And when you're not sick, you have a clinically stable clinical endpoint. You're stable. You're not at risk for having a decompensation quickly. That clinical endpoint of stability typically takes between 7 and 30 days, not 4.5 days, which is the average length of stay in the hospital, which is why we are such heavy users of skilled nursing facilities after the hospital, why we have such a high readmission rate into the hospital, because the time in the hospital is inadequate, not because the hospitals are bad people, quite the contrary. The financial model does not allow them to keep the patient in long enough to have a reliable recovery. It is a fundamental business model problem with hospitals' fixed costs. And by the way, stay tuned. In the next 2 years, you're going to hear the exact same thing about colleges and universities. It's just the cost of educating the student, the bricks and mortar of educating the student after parents have borrowed $60,000 to watch their kids go online in their living room and have an education. There's going to be a revolution in colleges and universities for the same exact reason. The fixed cost burden, our absolute appetite for buildings. My colleague from Hopkins, Bruce Leff, calls it edifice complex. We're so in love with buildings, particularly in healthcare and education. That penalty allows the system to rob the services from the end user because the cost and the burden of those facilities are so high. But until now, it really hasn't been in the crosshairs. And there was a big article last week by Fast Company, which came after the Time Magazine article about this issue, specifically about the fixed costs of hospitals, which, by the way, is $800 billion with a B. And that's the exact amount of money we spend on defense. So just imagine you're the President of the United States, or imagine you're somebody else. Imagine you're making the decision, do I spend money on defense or on buildings for hospitals? Because it's the same amount of money, $800 billion. And that burden on our economy is so large, on our ability to shape policy is so large. So where are we getting the money? We're borrowing it from China, which is now our new best friend. Not. So the whole architecture of our financial system, funding buildings that don't deliver care, in a lot of cases, that we borrow money for and compromise on other programs and other national necessities, that interplay is now becoming strategically more relevant and more transparent. And I think that's what's going to drive change, is the economics just don't work anymore.